I thought it much more important than occupying an hour of talk, which is an occupational hazard of people in my work. I thought it much better that we engage in some discussion about what lessons we're drawing from Alberta labor history and what's going on in contemporary terms in our country and in our world. So I would propose to take 4 or 5 of your questions in a row or statements and then try to react and then do 4 more others. Hear from you right now. Let's do 4 and then react and then do 4 more.
Hi, welcome back. My name is Gordon. I wanted to ask you about, I guess, what the government calls back to work legislation. But in my eyes, since probably the 60s, workers haven't defied back to work legislation. In fact, it seems like all 3 levels of government sit around and wait, and then eventually we're going to pass it. And the rank and file on the work sites just seem to go now that, oh yeah, well, whether it's 5 days or 10 days. But quite frankly, we're not going to make any gains as workers until we start defying the rules that are made by other people. What are your thoughts?
Okay. Thank you, Gord. I'll deal with that, but let's hear from more people and just get a few of your thoughts on the table here. Brother at the top there.
Abati, UNA. I guess my question is, where does labor go from here? Given your presentation and the lack of labor involvement in the movements that's going on in Quebec, student strikes and things like that, where do we go from here? Where does labor go from here?
Okay, thank you very much. 2 more, and then we'll react, and then we'll come back at you. And then there's a gentleman over here. Go ahead.
Hi there, Cameron Westhead from United Nurses of Alberta. Some of the things we've been hearing from the federal government and other kind of associated groups is about letting the market decide wages, market pressures deciding wages. I'm just wondering if you can kind of comment on that in regards to the pressure of unions and their impact on wages, and also if the market is truly kind of an unadulterated market situation that would properly decide wages.
Okay, thank you. And there's a gentleman here, and then we'll go at those questions, and more people can intervene. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Doug Magnuson recently retired from staff of the Health Sciences Association of Alberta. So, Brother Moist, you were characterizing 1919 in Winnipeg in part as a strike only over wages with the metal workers or whatever. And my imagination of it is that it was much more than that. The world had become electrified by the victory of the Red Revolution in Moscow and spreading into what became the Soviet Union. And in the general strike itself, it wasn't a strike in solidarity with wage demands for a nickel more an hour. It was solidarity itself that electrified the working class and realized the solidarity that we don't really experience today, in my view, except on very rare occasions, that provided the vision. Like, in other words, it wasn't just about, I think you were saying that it was primarily about wages, but it wasn't Bolshevik. Well, I kind of think it was, and I wonder if you could take another look.
Okay, thank you. I'll go in reverse order. Thank you for that, Doug. One thing I did learn in university, not very much about labor history in the University of Manitoba in the 70s, but one thing I did learn when I read O.D. Skelton, and he was the first I read, unlike Berkeson from the U of Calgary or others, who completely dismissed the notion that this was empathy with the Bolshevik uprising in Russia. And he did that by examining the Labor Council minutes from back then. There was some solidarity with workers elsewhere around the world, but primarily the ballot question given to the unions in Winnipeg, about 12,000 people cast ballots, and it was 11,000 and something to 500 and something workers who voted to strike if necessary. It was over the union recognition of the metal trades, not to bargain one-on-one with their employers, but with the industry wide in the city of Calgary, in the city of in the city of Winnipeg. So there was an empathy by R.B. Russell and other strike leaders with what was going on around the planet. But there was a belief that workers, if we stuck together, there could be gains made by those workers in Winnipeg. That was the primary purpose of the strike vote and the primary motivation. And it wasn't a strike like we saw in Gainers where scabs were being bussed in and we had to hold the picket line. The strike leaders in Winnipeg told the members of the public, stay home. Go about your duties as normal. There was no rallies called. People naturally gathered in Victoria Park, which was cemented over in 1922. Business took away that gathering spot. But the events of Bloody Saturday and that were initiated by the right, by business. This was not a strike at all where we were attempting to overthrow in any way, shape, or form society. There were meetings with the mayor. There were meetings with the provincial government of Rodman Roblin, a distant relative of Duff Roblin. And the workers played within the system. They were not playing outside of the system. This was, if you read the prosecution by A.J. Andrews, he searched the Labor Temple on James Avenue. It burnt down. We lost all these records. But the James Avenue Labor Temple was burned down in the 20s or early 30s. They tore that Labor Temple apart looking for pamphlets about what was going on in Russia, and they found 2 or 3. What they found was a whole bunch of other union stuff about stuff going on in Winnipeg in the labor movement. Cameron's question about letting the market decide and the market as a kind of a instrument to set wages, it always strikes me that business are raving marketeers, but they become socialists when they want something. The people on Wall Street did a good job in extracting us to pay for their excesses, and those presiding over Air Canada and Canadian Pacific, they don't believe in the market setting wages for flight attendants or machinists or Teamsters at CP. They're working in lockstep with a federal government that's compliant with them. So Mr. Harper would probably tell you he's a free marketeer who believes in the legitimacy of the free market, except when it comes to regulating temporary foreign workers or Canadian trade unionists. And the first 2 questions I'll deal as one. Gord's question about back to work legislation and the brother from the nurses union about where does labor go from here. It's always been my view that no one set of workers in one plant are going to, in today's climate, defy back to work legislation if they believe they'll be isolated, if it's just the workers in that plant. They need to know, there's a saying, the longer the line, the shorter the strike. And the defiance of back to work legislation is not the norm in our country. If it ever was, it's less so now, because I do think workers are more isolated within their own unions. I'm a believer in parent labor bodies like labor councils and federations and the Canadian Labor Congress. I believe in those structures notionally. I've participated in all of them. I like to think our union, CUPE, has good relations with most unions in the Canadian Labor Congress, but people are increasingly isolated within their own unions, which mitigates against a Winnipeg-like response. Winnipeg strikers didn't win, but they had a massive response that wasn't confined to one shop or one industry. We're far away from that kind of class consciousness that existed in Canada and around the world, which is gets to the brother's final question, where does labor go from here? A couple of places in my view. Number one, I don't think labor aligning with a political party is a guarantee of success. I know a few examples around the world of labor isolating itself and not aligning itself politically as a guarantee of anything but no success. That's the first point. And secondly, I would argue that workers no longer live near where they work. The monthly union meeting is not a social and informational feature of people's lives. People, many CUPE members have 2 and 3 jobs just to try to survive. So workers gathering in a union hall or in a place like this to talk about what's going on in the world, not just the issues at work, it seems to me is not going to happen but we haven't harnessed technology as well as the right has in terms of using it to politicize workers. We passed a policy paper in November that how can we restore working class consciousness to 600,000 CUPE members across Canada in all kinds of jobs from coast to coast. So we had 9 provinces meet in convention this spring, and one small thing we did on this journey to class consciousness is have a breakfast meeting, not in the convention, no microphones, no voting, to talk about economics from a worker's point of view. About what are the business pages talking about? Gross domestic product, what the hell is that? Well, consumer spending and purchasing houses or paying rent and spending on public services is 86% of Canadian gross domestic product. And so I said to the CUPE members gathered, you are the wealth of the country. You're the economy. You wouldn't know that if you picked up the business pages of any paper today, or if you watched whole television stations devoted towards business. Business is important in and of itself, but consumer spending, people spending money on rent and houses, and public services, our collective wealth, that's 86% of Canadian GDP. Workers are the economy of Canada. They don't feel like they own the economy of Canada right now. And if we can't retrieve that kind of class consciousness, anything's possible if there's a commonality of, what's the right word? If there's a class consciousness amongst workers, anything is possible in terms of what kind of nation we're going to have, or what kind of laws we're going to have, or what kind of laws we're going to defy. It's not possible to defy those bad laws in the absence of class consciousness. If there's time for another round of a few questioners, is there time? Yes. Okay. Who's got the microphone? And grab these hands, and we'll take 5 in a row. There's 2 or 3 over here, and there's a gentleman up there. We'll do 5, and then we'll react.
Hi, I'm Jerry from HSAA. And, a lot of the stories that we've been hearing so far today seem to center around strikes of the past, our labor history around real struggles of the past, and that seems to be when labor has been strongest. However, as you well know, back-to-work legislation is what someone was talking about earlier, but strikes are tending to be almost, I think they're going to become legislated against overall, not just in individual situations, but it seems to be that strikes are being taken out of our arsenal of tools. And if you could comment on how that's going to impact labor in the next 100 years.
Okay. So gentleman over here, and there's 3 over on this side after that.
Albert Johnson, UFCW Local 1118. My comments are on the temporary foreign workers and the actions that I believe organized labor has to do in order to do that. And it's a broader picture than what it is. All our collective agreements that have temporary foreign workers, the employers must give the workers they hire either fit the ANIP program, or employers have to give them the tools to meet the ANIP program and support them through the process of getting it, of going through to get their permanent residency and their status and be able to reunite their families and the rest of it. Unfortunately, with the government and labor itself not being able to, the government not supporting it, and this provincial government keeps telling our employers, well, you don't have to do that, you don't have to do that, what are you doing that for? You get to pick who goes through, which is a constant battle. But on top of that, the fact that organized labor hasn't made that an ongoing, where temporary foreign workers are being employed within unionized settings, have not made that a bargaining priority to protect these workers, because they become the pawns of the employers on an ongoing basis. We had a labor dispute at Maple Leaf Poultry here in Edmonton a couple years ago, where that position that Maple Leaf did, which has been across the country identified as how good an employer they are doing that, didn't want to sign that agreement guaranteeing that they put these people forward. But as a labor movement, they're in our work sites, the temporary foreign workers are in our work sites across the country, that as an organization, we have to take that battle, because we can negotiate wage increases and working conditions across the board, but as these people roll over and get abused because they can spend X amount of months or years or whatever sent there, and we all know that if if they terminate a temporary foreign worker, that they're going to be well home in their home country before they come through. So I guess my comment, besides my comment, my question is, where can the labor movement pull itself together so we're all going in the direction? Thanks.
Okay, there's three more over here very quickly, and then we'll do our best to wrap up in 10 minutes as we're supposed to. Okay, Professor Palmer had his hand.
Yeah, Brian Palmer, Trent University. I wanted to thank you for your talk, which I found very stimulating and interesting, but I also wanted to push you a bit on from the same direction as my colleague over here in the health services. I think it's absolutely right that the Winnipeg General Strike, of course, was not about Bolshevism and was not really struggled around as Bolshevism, but then neither was Bolshevism. I mean, it was about peace, land, and bread, just like the Winnipeg General Strike was about wages and conditions. But when you're parading with, by authority of the strike committee, you pose instinctually a question of dual power. And the real point I wanted to get to is what hasn't been mentioned much. We are all very well aware that the labor movement has been in a kind of free fall of crisis for some time. But nobody has mentioned that the left has been in a free fall of crisis for some time. And that as much as the labor movement is being defeated, the left is being defeated and has been over the course of the 20th century as well. And what I found fascinating about your talk about the project of, which it always is a project, of building and making class consciousness, is that all the people that you were talking about in terms of Winnipeg were socialists. Most of them self-defined as revolutionary socialists. They existed in parties and organizations, cultures, if you will, outside the labor movement, outside the trade unions, but that were very intimately connected with them. And it seems to me that that is something that actually has to be addressed. And the troubling feature, and I suppose the real question that I'd pose is, to what extent has the leadership of the labor movement itself contributed to the suppression of that left that has been fundamental to the creation historically of the class consciousness that then can live itself out in very productive ways inside the trade union movement. And that can make the trade union movement the sort of tribune of the people, of all people. I mean, it isn't just that the Occupy Wall Street and the students in Quebec, see the trade union movement as different than them, that they are. It's also perhaps that the trade union movement needs to see those people more and more as the kind of people that it needs to align with in broadening the conception of what the workers' movement is really all about. But so I'm pushing you a bit, but I also wanted to thank you for opening those questions.
Okay, well, there's enough there, so. Well, let me start with the brother from the HSA talking about strikes, and we're in a post-strike period. We may be in a period of lull around strikes, but I'm not sure strikes are going the way of the dodo bird. I think at points in time, workers will simply go beyond their leadership and assert their rights in the workplace. But I also think that activities of the labor movement beyond striking, where we act in unison or potentially act in unison, are just as powerful as strikes and just strike just as much fear into the state. I was thinking as Professor Palmer talked, I'm a great fan of the laws that have been put in place in Canada, unlike the United States, where unions are prohibited, as is business, from donating to political parties. I've never thought that the union movement's greatest contribution to politics could be a check. The last year that union and corporate donations were allowed in Manitoba, the business community out-donated workers who were very supportive of the NDP in Manitoba by $30 to 1. So our greatest strength at times is people prepared to speak with one another and speak with their neighbors and knock on doors. And that sounds like setting the bar very low for a trade union movement. But if in that province I can motivate 500 CUPE members to give up a month of their lives and talk to their neighbors and walk around their neighborhoods, it seems to me that we have much more in common with one another as workers, organized or not, than business has with them. And business has a party in this country. They have a couple of parties. Some may argue they have more than a couple of parties. But mass actions beyond strikes are, Quebec students are proving to us that some of the most austere legislation in recent Canadian history can be laughed at and mocked. And their pots and their pans, and it's not just students any longer, at 8:15 each night in most Quebec communities, it's not just students with their pots and pans, and so people are mocking the state, and there's a lot of overtime being paid to police, as there was in 1986 here in this city. But I think when mass numbers of people mock bad laws and bad politicians, it's more powerful than the withdrawal of the labor. The brother from the UFCW, and that union is to be commended for the work with temporary foreign workers. How can Canadian Labour take this battle about exploitation of temporary foreign workers? Well, and how can workers not be as pawns of employers? Well, the social union dimension of the Canadian Labour movement is part of our history, and it needs to become more of our future history. If CUPE members think their lot in life, 4,000 collective agreements across Canada, from anywhere from 5 members in a daycare to 20,000 inside workers in Toronto, I say to CUPE members constantly, if you believe 100% of the collective power of your union dues should be spent just on CUPE workplaces, we will simply die a slow death. We have a moral responsibility and a vested interest in keeping social programs alive in Canada and helping increase union density. If the Abitibi-Bow-Waters workers get smashed, or the Valley-Inco workers get smashed, it's workers getting smashed, and it's just a question of when you'll be smashed. That talk, I can tell you, I spend a lot of my life in union meetings and in other unions' meetings, doesn't happen very often. Most trade union leaders in Canada don't attend one another's conventions. They're too busy. Everybody's busy nowadays. You're all busy. A trade union leader said to me recently, is it possible to be busier every year than it was the year before? You get more emails this year than you got last year. I say to CUPE shop stewards, I just said to 150 of them yesterday in Saskatoon, you get more shit every day from the members than thank yous. You get told how bad a job we're doing as a union and how bad management is and why can't you do something about them more than you get thank yous. The whole room was in nervous, fluttering laughter because it's true. And very few speeches are made within the ranks of trade unionists about the legitimacy of spending our resources to help non-unionized workers. 11.5 million people went to work today out of a workforce of 17.5 million. They don't have a pension plan at work, and they're not going to get one from the boss. And they're not going to participate in RRSPs. They can't afford to. Only the trade union movement could expand the Canada Pension Plan, double it, we increase our contributions collectively, and all workers would have a greater measure of integrity in retirement. Only the trade union movement. The first chairperson of the CPP Investment Board, I was opposed to CPP changing the mandate and going into equity markets, but it happened, was a guy from Bay Street. And he wanted to meet with unions. I was in Winnipeg at that time. And he looked at us and said, this was in the late 90s, he said, why did you guys stop, you labor people, why did you stop fighting for a state pension plan that was fair to all workers? And we all looked at him. I didn't know at that time the history of the CPP in Canada. Business kept it down to the levels where it's at. The trade union movement in the 50s and 60s, Stanley Knowles was defeated once in an election in his life, and the CLC hired him, and they started a campaign for a Canada pension plan between 1957 and 1961. Then he got re-elected in 61. Only the trade union movement can take on that brother's question about temporary foreign workers or things like an expansion of the Canada pension plan. And we must take some of our precious dues, apart from representing workers at work, and pursue broad social agendas, which leads me to the most difficult and the broadest question asked by Brian Palmer. To what extent has labor leadership contributed to kind of the demise or the state of the labor movement today? And that's a tough question. That's a more than a bit of a push. But I would say that, first of all, there are too many unions in Canada. 55 affiliates of the CLC won't exist 10 years from now. And we as a movement can embrace that and create more mergers and more strength as a movement, or it'll be done for us by business simply kicking the crap out of what's left of the private sector that's organized in Canada. So when I see my good friend Dave Coles from CEP and the auto workers talking about forming a new union, they're showing great leadership, and we need more of that. The forces we faced as workers are bigger than any CLC affiliate. CUPE has amongst the most resources of any union in Canada. CUPE can't win the fight it faces without support of other workers. And if we can't move the union density rate upwards in Canada, then we are going to continue on the long, slow decline. So I'll end by saying there's a reason I can't be here tomorrow, and Dave is aware of it, but I very much wanted to be here today. And in this great job of being CUPE president, there's any number of invitations every day. Why is the Alberta Labour History Institute so important to me? Because I truly believe if we just file grievances, if we just serve notice to bargain, if we just run this campaign in CUPE, those are all important things. We should do those things. But there's a bigger picture out there. Every single person in this room knows somebody in your family or your neighborhood who is stuck in a shit job, who's a good worker, but is undervalued by their employer and ultimately by extension by society. We need to talk as trade union leaders. I guess my answer to Brian's question would be, we need to be prepared to admit past failures, and the failure to learn lessons from our history is the ultimate failure of any trade union leader, at the local union leadership level, regional or national. So we need to be a little bit of humility beyond hubris to admit where we've wavered as a movement, and we need to reconnect with those values that saw people walk in the streets, not just for wages and working conditions, but they believed in a different vision of the world. They were not attempting to overthrow the state, in my opinion. They threatened the state by their silent marches, by their delivery of milk with that sign that was probably a mistake at the end of the day, that sign. But every time I meet with shop stewards from any union, any affiliate of the CLC, in a room like this, people are great volunteers. They want that vision. They're dying for it. They're dying for somebody who, I've watched Mulcair in the 3 months that he's been leader of the NDP, and they're going to smash the shit out of him if he keeps talking about the Dutch disease and Canada being too much of a resource economy right now. And we don't manufacture anything, nothing value added. And if globalization means, the trade minister Ed Fast argued yesterday, what are you, scared of globalization in Canada? We can compete. Well, if globalization and competition means more lousy jobs in Canada, less decent jobs in Canada, then Canadians, not just trade unionists, Canadians are dying for leadership that says we can be better than this. They've had power too long. Our power is untapped. Thank you.